This is the video podcast for Chapter 13 on wetlands in the landscape context. And if we take a step back and look at the big picture of what this class is about, what I'm trying to do is introduce you to the hydrological cycle in different patches of the landscape, whether those have been wetlands, urban areas, rangeland. We'll go through riparian and, of course, uplands in different contexts. We've been looking at those individual patches, and we're getting closer to the time in this course when we're going to be integrating across the whole landscape to see the hydrological cycle at work and how it interacts with biological organisms, especially vegetation. But within a wetlands context, there already is an incredible amount of research just trying to look at what is the role of wetlands in a watershed. What we're going to see is defined as wetland functions, and then how does society value those functions, and perhaps even ultimately assign dollar values to that in what we call ecosystem services. So what we want to do, what I'm going to try to do in this video podcast is introduce you to examples of human use and interaction of wetlands and what values are assigned. And there's no place better to start in this than to look at the case of the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is basically almost one giant coastal wetland, and it shows a very strong example of one way of valuing wetlands in terms of the land itself, rather than necessarily the pure wetland functionality. So when we look at the Netherlands, and the map is shown in the upper right as the yellow area here off of the North Sea. In the lower right, you can see a map that shows the outline of that area, and all of the land in blue is below sea level, and then the land in red is above sea level, and this is for current conditions. Like I said, it's a coastal area that was predominantly coastal wetlands, and historically, they went through a process of land change to adapt that to meet agricultural and modern civilization. And the key to that has been a form of agriculture known as Polder Agriculture, and this is an aerial photo that shows what these polders look like. The process began a long time ago. Typically marshes, of course, are located at an elevation between low and high water, right, from the amplitude of the tidal cycle. And beginning with those marshes, there was a desire to convert those into agricultural land. And this happens the whole world over. It happens here in the United States, but it also happened in the Netherlands. And so what happens is that they built a dike. So a dike is another word would be a levee, but basically you take sediment or dirt out of the marsh area and pile it up to then create a barrier between the land and the sea. And then that land is called a polder, and then it can be used for agriculture. Initially, water from the polder will be able to drain by gravity out through the levee. Like if you had a one-way gate, so water could flow through a pipe out, but if there was a big storm, you could try to block that off so that the pipe doesn't become an access way back onto the polder. However, over time, the elevation of the polder lowers, and that's because wetland sediments are highly organic, and as you farm organic sediments, some of that carbon is respired away, and so the soil is lost. Also, by dewatering that, there is a natural subsidence that takes place as the sediment is compacted. And then finally, sea level is rising. So that we call that eustatic sea level rise. The fact that over time, since the Ice Age, as climate has been warming, the ice caps have been melting, and not only is sea level rising from that additional water, but just the heating of the ocean itself does create some expansion of the water and rising as well. So relatively speaking, the elevation of the polder has declined. And that then led to the development of windmills to create, have the energy to pump water out using the energy of the wind. And these are the iconic windmills that are well known from the art world, to characterize agricultural, rural Netherlands. Well, once you have those dikes, then you enter the more modern urbanized era since 1880, and then the dikes have become the primary locations for development and living, among other places. But a lot of development, as shown in this sketch that's shown here, and so then that increases the concentration and the dependence on those dikes. Here is an aerial photo of one area, and now you can see in the most modern era that there's a levee here. The whitish color is the road on top of the levee. The green is grass, and this is now an engineered. This is like a high quality, robust levee surrounding a polder, which has been converted into urbanized land in this instance. So the Netherlands has had a long history of flooding. I mean, any coastal area is going to be susceptible to flooding. But this polder agriculture is highly susceptible to damages and loss of life as a result of flooding. And so here are some different dates. You can see thousands of people have died in this area. Large amounts of land have been flooded. And in 1927, they even went so far as to close off the entire estuary that's there. So specifically, if we zoom in on a section of the Netherlands, you can see that in blue on this map is a very large estuary. However, what you can see is that there's a kind of a black line and a red line, and this shows the locations where they've built a dike entirely across the mouth of the estuary, and then also one splitting this here, which has created these independent lakes. And so that provides defense against flooding from the sea into the estuary and then spilling out onto all of the land. And here's a photo of that big engineered dike that's been built across the estuary. So, from my perspective, having grown up near Chesapeake Bay, the idea of actually building a dam across the mouth of that, or imagine if we built a dam across the mouth of San Francisco. Like, instead of having Golden Gate Bridge, forget the bridge, just build a road right across, just close it off, and then instead of like Carquinez Bridge and all the other bridges, just build dikes and roads. So it's it totally transforms the environment of that setting. However, when you think about the context of thousands of people's at risk, the economy's at risk. So, under that level of pressure, then, it's easy to understand why one would take those steps as a society, but still recognizing that that's a huge environmental consequence. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a motivation to try to understand what are the values that we can have as a society in not doing that? But if we were going to keep wetlands and value them for whatever they may do, then the question arises, well, what do they do? Like, how can we hang our hat on this idea? And this is a table that lists some of what we call wetland functions. So a function is a physical, chemical, or biological process. It's discernible as part of an interconnected system. So the wetland is one system, and it's best to think about it as a system, but it's inevitable that we try to piece out, what's going on. Let's look at something that's taking place that you can pick out and value, so to speak. But so here, there's no values laden onto these. It's just, here's what's going on. And we can divide these into hydrological things like groundwater recharge to the wetlands, or the wetland can be a source of water, like if it's a slope wetland, storing water during floods, having a role in regional or local climate conditions, creating microclimate, affecting the vertical or horizontal water balances, essentially. Biological productivity, geochemical cycling, processing of carbon, and then, of course, habitat and providing a place for ecological functions, which could be predation, birth and death, migration, and competition. Society then can look at those functions and decide what value to place on that. there's a lot of ways we can do that. We can do that as technocrats. We can, within a government or as non-governmental organizations, we can try to say, well, here is what we know, how this might affect the economy or how it might affect society or individual communities. Like, for example, if you build a constructed wetland as opposed to, what would be, how much wastewater can you treat as opposed to building a wastewater treatment plant? So you go from natural wetland, constructed wetland, and wastewater treatment plant, you can pretty much get a dollar value for the potential cleaning that a wetland can actually do. Another way to go is to conduct a sociological survey where you ask people, hey, how much would you be willing to spend in a tax or user fee to protect a particular value of a wetland? And then that gives you a democratic, economically driven sort of free market answer. And so that's another way of valuing a function in a wetland. And here are many different examples of things that wetlands do that's important to society. Let's look at some of these, especially from a hydrological perspective. So the number one thing that I think is easy to imagine by this point of the course is the role of wetlands in buffering the speed and volume of flow that occurs from runoff during storms. Whether it's a full flood or not isn't so important, but whether it was the bark on a tree or the riparian zone or a green roof or an infiltration strip, we all know by now in this class the importance of having some way of reducing runoff or having it extend over a longer period of time. And wetlands do that. So you can see that in this graph, on the top is an example where there are wetlands associated with the source areas primarily, and then if all those wetlands are removed, like if you urbanize in those tributary heads. So with wetlands, the peaks are reduced, and then more of that water is released during base flow, so you get a more consistent flow through time. There are still highs and lows, but they're just heavily buffered. If you remove the wetlands, then you get these extreme fluctuations where when it rains, you instantaneously get runoff much more quickly. You get a very abrupt peak that's very significantly higher, and then it drops off and you have no flow. To illustrate this with a real case, study has been done on the Charles River in Massachusetts. In this case, they concluded that retaining 8,500 acres of wetlands would prevent flood damages of $6 million for a single hurricane event. So the Army Corps of Engineers opted to purchase wetlands for $7.3 million in lieu of building a $30 million flood control structure. And here's the analysis, an area where there's no wetlands having this very high peak, and an area with wetlands and how it doesn't have that peak. So showing a head-to-head comparison of two different areas. The y-axis is discharge, the x-axis is time, so during a flood event, and seeing what happens. And you can read this here for yourself. But there is a significant value in retaining wetlands for hydrological buffering. Another thing that wetlands do is they trap constituents. And constituents could be just about anything, but the first thing we can think of is sediment. So, for example, this is a method that was developed to be able to quantify how much sediment does a wetland develop. So you just take a stick of electrical conduit, shove it into the ground, and then cap it with a ceramic tile. And that ceramic tile just sits on the ground surface, and whatever accumulates on that is can be quantified to see how much sediment is accumulated. And here's a case on a floodplain where a massive amount of sand has accumulated, showing the strong sedimentary buffering effect. And it's important to understand that this trapping is not necessarily permanent. It could be, but it also could be a buffering, just like the water, where for a period of years the sediment is held in the wetland, but as the sediment supply conditions change, this could be removed. And I refer you back to the, that weighing balance that I showed you in the urban lecture for sediment, which is also called the Lane diagram, because it was developed by someone named Lane. And depending on the supply of sediment, the size, the amount of water, you can have either deposition or erosion. And that's true in wetlands as well. So here's a photo of a wetland both in summer and in winter. And you can see that there's a significant difference in its sedimentary buffering capability depending on seasonality. And then here's the data. So on the x-axis is time, and the samples here are on a biweekly basis, so the 2-week amount of sediment that's collected, and the sedimentation rate is measured in grams of sediment per square centimeter per year. So even though these are biweekly samples, just to create a simple basis for comparison, the numbers are expanded to what it would be on an annual basis. And you can see a very strong differentiation based on the type of wetland plants present. And I think I showed you in the the coastal wetland where I was talking about the different vegetation types for tidal freshwater wetlands, and I showed this low marsh that you see here, and then there's like a middle marsh and a high marsh in the background, and then the forest. So here the Pioneer Mudflat, which has no vegetation at all, shows these wild swings in sedimentation. So generally though, accumulating material, everything is pretty much net accumulating material, and there's a strong differentiation for each plant type, and elevation band in this case. Here's an example of sediment deposition in a floodplain context. You can see that the tree, probably was initially, when it germinated, had a ground elevation here, and then all this stem of the tree has been buried. This is a photo from the Eel River in California. And this actually provides a basis to quantify sedimentation rates over a long period of time, over like the life of a tree. So this was from a study by Hupp and Morris, and this scientist, Cliff Hupp, has spent a lot of his career studying the role of vegetation in lowland forests. And so you can see the idea here is to find what we call the flare root, or sort of basal root that represents the ground elevation at the time the tree established. So you dig down until you hit that root, and that gives you the thickness of sediment. And then they use an increment borer for the tree to look at the tree rings. And so by counting the tree rings, you find out the age of the tree. So the deposition rate equals the thickness of sediment that's accumulated divided by the age of the tree. And that tells you, so many centimeters per year has accumulated. So using that approach, here are the kinds of sedimentation rates that have been given, and you can see that there is a trend where the lower the elevation, the more sediment accumulates. And the mechanism there is at the lower elevation, it's going to flood sooner, it's going to stay flooded for a longer duration, and the longer that is flooded, the more time it is for sediment to settle out, or possibly the more water is coming into that area than at the higher elevations. So the sedimentation rates, in this case, are varying from 0 to 0.6 centimeters per year. So that's just a vertical accretion, whereas the previous data I showed you was a mass flux in grams per square centimeter per year. You have to know the density of the sediment to convert between the two, but that is feasible. This shows a comparison among different sites. On the left, the percent of total wetlands as either emerged shrub or forested wetlands. So this is the percentages, and then you have the sedimentation rate as the line. And you can see that these sites that have are emerged shrub, there's one site here, I guess, that has the highest value. And then, comparing the other sites, they look pretty indistinguishable to me, but there is one site that really stands out as an outlier. Okay, so moving on with other types of functions, there's more of a role for the hydrogeomorphic, the hydrogeologic context of the ground to play a role. So here's a schematic in which we have sediment or soil overlying a relatively shallow barrier. In this case, showing 3 to 8 meters thickness of land above this barrier. So the soil is probably only at the very top, and then there's just there's just this. Well, I guess it is still soil, but above the decomposed material. I guess it also could just be, it could be rock, but it's also much more permeable and porous than whatever this underlying barrier is, which is usually a bedrock, aquiclude. And so when rain is falling on that land, you know that it's very likely that it's going to go into the ground, and then as it goes into the ground, it's going to accumulate, and there'll be a water table, and the water will flow primarily horizontally because there is this barrier. As a result of that, when you get to the riparian wetland that could be present there, the thickness of the sediment is going to be relatively shallow, and there's going to be a great opportunity for whatever constituents are in the water to be taken up by those plants. Similarly, if there's any Hortonian overland flow or a saturation excess, that's where it's running off on the surface, then those can be interacting with the roots and the base of the trees or any herbaceous plants. So you can see removal of nitrate from groundwater is expected to be relatively high, and therefore that's a very important function where there's a good opportunity to do that. Removal of sediment and sediment-borne pollution is very high, and removal of dissolved phosphorus is considered medium to low. However, like here in the Central Valley of California, it's really not as important to create these riparian buffers from this one perspective. And that's because the groundwater is moving down in a much more vertical way, and it can just bypass that buffer. There may be some contact sometimes, but it's going to be far less than when the aquiclude is close. And you can see here, this is 10 to 40 meters thickness. So there's low removal of nitrate in this case. Here's some data to illustrate this, where there is a shallow clay aquiclude that's like 2 to 6 meters down. And so they put in a series of wells that are shown as these vertical lines. There's an agricultural field, a very steep bank, and then a floodplain prior to reaching the stream. Also, the water table is shown. And here we have distance from field. So the left is at the cornfield, and then as you go to the right, you're getting further into the riparian zone. And you can see that all this data does show a decline such that by about 30 meters distance, we have significantly lower concentrations of groundwater nitrate as nitrogen as nitrate than we do at the field. And then here's one study that shows a decline, but where overall the levels are relatively high. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just have a simple function where we could have percent watershed that has a percent of the watershed that is wetlands on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, the change in functionality as you increase wetlands. It's kind of like how we looked at the change in runoff or sediment with deforestation back in the forestry lectures. Unfortunately, we don't have good data sets to populate this yet. This is already an older study now, but it's the only one I've come across that that tries to show this, and it doesn't show a trend at all. So percent phosphorus retained, there's examples with small amounts of wetlands and then larger amounts. But another thing is it's very hard to find watersheds with a wide range of percent wetlands in them in order to do this. But there are some additional complexities that would help to explain why the functionality wouldn't necessarily be so simple. The first is that retention itself is not permanent. I mean, a wetland is not like a trash can that you fill forever, or like a landfill or something. I mean, a wetland has a storage capacity in the same way that the bark of a tree has a water storage capacity. There's only so much of a constituent that it can hold. Once it has a lot more of something than the surrounding area, then it's going to start giving it off. Another thing is a lot of constituents are held by sediment. But once the wetland has accreted to its full capacity, again, there's a space there for sediment to fill in. But once it's full, the sediment will likely start to bypass that wetland or be eroded out of it. There are also some pollutants where it just might not have any effect at all. Here's an example that shows retention of metals, copper, zinc, and iron, as well as organics in different areas of the tidal freshwater marsh. So zero would be just the natural flux associated with the sediment that might be in a tidal area, and then percent additional inputs means retention that can be associated with urbanization and land use primarily. And what you can see is that there are different habitats that are shown here. For organics, there is a net retention of material that's coming from additional input. So in this case with organics, that's likely to be forest material that's, you know, like washing or blowing into the wetland and then being stored. You could also see that the low marsh is the one that is preferentially retaining all of these constituents. So it has a relatively high sedimentation rate, and then it's storing this. But on the other hand, other ones, high marsh, middle marsh, and floating leaf, are actually giving these off. They are net retaining sediment, but these other constituents are being removed. So you can see that it isn't a uniform thing. Like a wetland doesn't just universally do one function across its whole area. Different parts of the wetland could be functioning quite differently, as shown here. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the topic of restoration. Restoration means that you take some place in the environment that has been degraded or altered by humans, and you try to put it back to how it was prior to the human disturbance. It's like the idea of art restoration, where, you know, a painting is hundreds of years old and you can hardly see the art anymore, and they have to try to clean it off without really disturbing it. You know, trying to retain the original artistic vision and detail without, you know, losing it, but bringing that back out. There are other things that one can do. One can do wetland rehabilitation, which is to put back some things, but not necessarily get all the way back to the original state. There's wetland creation, which means to convert a wetland area into a wetland, like create it where it didn't exist. There's wetland enhancement, where you think of a specific thing that the wetland can do and you make it do that better. So these terms are generally used interchangeably, and I'm going to use restoration as an umbrella in this case. The approach is you have to specify what are the ecological goals that you have. That has to be not only in terms of societal values, but what are the functions? Like, you know, what is it that this is supposed to do? Are you trying to create habitat? Are you trying to get more hydrological buffering, sediment retention, you know, biogeochemical cycling? Once you figure out what you need, what you want, then primarily you're going to have to alter the form. You know, like land form is linked to process, and usually you have to change form to change process. Now that isn't always true. You could change the flux of inputs and outputs somehow independently of changing the form. So you have to decide, you know, this is why it says hydrogeomorphic, like how do you change fluxes and how do you change forms to get what you want. Once you've done that physical alteration, then you can decide if you need to kind of jumpstart or goose the system by adding plants. Alternately, you could rely on what's called the seed bank. And then finally, you implement the project, monitor, and learn. So here's an example of wetland creation. You see these agricultural fields. This is here in California in San Joaquin County. And there's agricultural field. It was a big square field. They cut a dike, or not cut, but they filled a dike across the diagonal. And then there was the river actually is now flowing in this unnatural canal, and then they bust some holes in here and allow the river to flood in. They also made it a swale pond here, as well as this other one. So to create a mix of like perennial, well, I wouldn't say perennially, but seasonally inundated pond with flood-induced changes to the system. Here's a case, also this is in San Pablo Bay, as part of the San Francisco Bay complex, where you have a river and you have agricultural land. In this case, there were openings made in the dike, and that's it. And you can see that a channel network, they might have created some initial channel network, I can't remember, but a channel network developed and sediment came in because the river is already quite sediment laden, and it on its own it built up a marsh. And so here you can see, like, through time you start where you just open it up. There's a lot of subtidal. We say subtidal means it's below low water, and then a small amount of intertidal area. With an abundance of sediment, then it starts to fill in, and you see the onset of creeks, and then the full development of creeks and marsh surfaces. So this is Carl's Marsh, and if you're driving on Highway 37, look to the right as you cross the Petaluma River, and you can see that. You could also see it on Google Earth. I did mention, when do you need to do plantings or not? It's really helpful if you do some experiments prior to the project where you take the soil, create a wetland condition like in a laboratory or what we call mesocosm experiment, like a small plot, and see what the seed bank is like. And so here we see over a period of years for a wetland, here's the relative abundance of seeds for these different species. It's not so important what they are, but Bidens, Cuscuta, Impatiens, Peltandra aerifolium, and other. And you can see there's a lot of Cuscuta here, some Bidens, and then a lot of Impatiens. So this is a little bit of a drier context, but still a wetland. And then, so from the seed bank, here's what you see in the seedlings. And there is a really good representation of Bidens and, not Cuscuta, whatever is the white, the Impatiens, right? And then when you look at what actually is there as the full cover, it does change quite a bit. So, the seed bank is very important. It doesn't mean that what grows is just going to be from the seed bank, because you could have migrating seeds that are coming through, as well as that you have competition, predation, birth and death and everything else. As well as just survival, survival given the environmental conditions. But having a seed bank means that you don't have to spend vast amounts of money on plantings, and in many cases the plantings just die anyway. Here's an example of our friend the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. I presented information about this in the urban lectures as like one of the most polluted rivers in America. There's been a lot of work in the lower part of this river in the tidal area to restore tidal freshwater wetlands. And these labels show like Kenilworth Marsh, Kingman Marsh, 1 and 2, Fringe Marsh, and then a reference site. So a reference site is a place that you think is functioning the way it's supposed to, and then you use that to get ideas about what to do at the restoration site. So working through the process of restoration, they built this Bladder Dam, and then used a discharge pipe here to bring in a slurry of sediment and fill it into the elevation that they want. And then there are these different areas. So here's the Anacostia River. There's an entryway, which in this photo is shown here. There's this more frequently flooded area in blue, and then the red shows the reconstructed wetlands with a little bit of predefined tidal channels. Notice that these artificial tidal channels are straight. That isn't a natural wetland condition, but it's really hard in muck to create well-designed sinuous channels. And if we look at, here's a photo through time of Kingman Marsh. As it has changed through time, you can see that it hasn't necessarily trended to fill in a whole lot so much as it's just changing where species are occurring through time. Here's an example of the data that has been collected. The x-axis is elevation in all these plots, and then the y-axis is number of species. Typical of wetlands, the drier you get, which means higher elevation, the more diversity of species there's going to be. And so this shows the distribution of Kingman in 2001 and 2004 with the same axes, indicating that there's actually less diversity later on than there was initially. So especially if you do a lot of plantings, or just in a case where there's a lot of natural redistribution of sediment and a lot of annual plants, there isn't going to be a lot of consistency in what happens. And then finally, in terms of restoring coastal marshes, it's very important to understand that when you build something, it's going to be attacked by disturbances. And some of well, in the coastal setting, one of the big disturbances is wind, because wind drives waves, and then waves can attack the wetland. And what you can see here are three variables that affect the erosion of wetlands. Fetch is the distance over which wind blows. The larger the fetch, the higher the waves. The second thing is sediment grain size. Coarser material is going to be harder to erode than fine sediment. And the third thing is the width of that area. And width means from the front, the shoreline, back into the back of the wetland, like that dimension. So you can imagine that the thicker that is, the more buffering, like those distal areas in the back, they'll be more protected. Whereas everything is right up against where the waves are, there's more risk. And so the x-axis gives values for each of these metrics. The y-axis gives you the percent of wetlands that either succeeded, like the project worked, and success is black, and then failure is white, and then uncertain or partial success is in between. So you can see that for very short fetches with less wind, there's a predominance of success and partial and relatively little failure. But by the time you get to very large fetches, the majority of sites fail. And there's fewer sites that have that condition, but still they tend to fail. With grain size, we can see that, let's see, in this case, swash sediment grain size, having a lot of fine sediment in this case, you'd think that that would tend to wash away. But it also could be that that makes it more cohesive. And so that cohesiveness means that it doesn't act as like an individual grain that the wind can attack, but it's like one mud body, and that's harder to move. So you can see that this fine sediment, so 0.4 millimeters, that's still relatively coarse. 64 microns would be the size delineation for sand. So this is still a mix of sand, silt, and clay. But once you have that this grain size is coarse sand, then it's not going to hold together, and it is going to be easier to be attacked. And then finally, when you have 6 meters or more width, then it's highly, highly successful. If it's very thin, it's pretty much going to fail. So this gives you some insights overall into wetland functions and values and the kinds of things that people are doing to restore wetlands.